Thank you, Julie, for that overly generous introduction. It's good to be here and to meet and see cousins I didn't know I had. It's good to see so many young people here. Some of you look less than thrilled, I have to say. It's not really a funeral. In fact, it raises a question that I think you might have in your mind, which is, why are we here? I mean, how can I relate? How can we relate to this old man with a long white beard who had 3 wives and 16 children and 116 grandchildren, and lived in a world that was totally different than our world? How can I connect with that person? How can I relate to those people? I think it's a legitimate question. I mean, their lives back then were so different than our lives. We have all the food we can eat. We have good housing. We have good health care, good education. We have supportive families and other kinds of institutions. We have good lives. Their lives were fraught with hardship. They didn't have enough food. The mortality rate was high. They didn't have good schools. They didn't have good housing. They dealt with difficulties every day of their lives just to survive. Well, let me give you my obligatory genealogy. You need to know that I'm a bona fide Taggart. Yeah. So, George Washington Taggart married Harriet Atkins Bruce, and I come from that life. Now, she died when she was only 24, and they had only one child. And I saw many of you were descended from that one child. And it just shows me how perilous and fragile life is, and how fortunate we are to be the end product of hundreds of generations of survivors. I mean, think about it. If she had died, this one child, as many of the others in that died, we would not be here. I think back at my Roberts genealogy. I had an ancestor that fought in the Revolutionary War and died in it. But he had a son before he went into the war, and I came from that son. And then in the Civil War, another one of my Robertses died in the Civil War. But he also had a son before he left to join the war. If he had died before that son was born, I wouldn't be here. And if Anna Liza had died, this only child of this marriage, many of us would not be here. We are the end product of hundreds of generations of survivors, and it's a remarkable thing. It only takes one missing link, one break in that chain of continuity, and we would not be here. It's something, I think, to be thankful for. So the answer to my question about how can we relate to these people, for me, it has to do with the common thread of humanity that we all share. They back there, it was different times, different people. They had to deal with issues of love, and family, and work, occupation, and many other issues that we share in common. And so, if we can get into the details of their lives and understand who these people were, we can connect with them in a true way. So, George Washington Taggart, I'm not the kind of expert many of you are on his life, but I do know some important things about him that help us to understand who he was and identify his role in the Mormon pioneer experience and how he was regarded by people at this time. I find it interesting, the story about his funeral. There were 84 carriages following the hearse, 84 carriages full of people. We're talking about Ridgeville, we're talking about Morgan County, a very small populated area. And that's a lot of people. I mean, that is, there may have been hundreds of people who came to his funeral to pay their respects and honor and celebrate the life of this man. It shows to me that he was a man of quality, of character, who made a significant contribution. I think that's one thing we can understand about him. So he worked in Nauvoo on the Nauvoo Temple. I love the story about carrying his 2-year-old daughter in a wheelbarrow to the work site. I don't know what she did all day in a wheelbarrow while he was doing carpentry work. And then, when she's only 2 years old, he volunteers to go with the Mormon Battalion. Walk those 4,000 some miles with inadequate shoes to the point that his feet were cut apart and bleeding. And it was a very difficult ordeal that he and the others experienced. He comes back to Salt Lake and finds out his family's not there. So he only stays 2 days, and then he goes back to Potawatomi County. That's where winter quarters and the council house were. He finds his family there. Unfortunately, his daughter, now 4 years old, and she didn't recognize him, still alive, and being taken care of. And so then they make the trek west, and it takes actually some years to get back to Salt Lake. In Salt Lake, we have these censuses. These are very useful things. In 1850, the census has him in Potawatomi County, has him as a joiner, not somebody who joins a lot of clubs and organizations. A joiner is a highly skilled carpenter who connects pieces of wood through mortise and tenon or dovetail connecting. And we know from his biography that he can make musical instruments, he makes furniture, but a joiner in this context means that he built buildings like this. So let's just take this building as an example. He touched, George Washington Taggart touched all of these elements. Look at this post. Okay, look at the one closest to you. For one thing, it's not just a square post. It's tapered, so it's wider on the bottom and it very subtly tapers as it gets to the top. Notice these corners. These are called chamfers. They're cut at an angle. And notice that about 2 feet up, and at the top, there's a little detail. It's called a lamb's tongue. These are called lamb's tongue chamfers. It's so that when you're walking by, you don't hit that hard 90-degree edge. If you happen to bang into it, you bang into something that's less intrusive, less dangerous. And at the top, these elements that are going horizontally with the curve, those are called bolsters. And they help transfer the load. And flour mills were full of machines. Every square inch of this building, when it was in use, was full of flour milling machinery. Machines to clean the wheat, to grind the wheat. In fact, right here, this was the wheat plant. This was the platform where the millstones were. There were 2 stones, one for grinding flour and one for grinding feed for animals. One was bigger than the other. And underneath here, there was a wheel pit. And there was a big heavy timber box with 2 holes in it, one for each of 2 turbines. These metal turbines were sent for by Brigham Young. They were 2 of the first 40 metal turbines ever made in the United States. Brigham Young was a very high-tech guy for his time. And these were hauled out here and installed in this mill. And underneath this wall, there are 2 stone arches in the stone down below, and the water came from 3 streams east of us into a mile-long wooden flume, and the water came down through these 2 arches into the turbines, down through the turbines spun around and turned to millstones, and then the water exited through an underground tunnel that's still there with stone walls and a stone arched roof and a wood floor, and that tunnel heads out under the aviary to someplace nobody knows where. That's where the water exited the mill. So George Washington Taggart, as a joiner, crafted everything that you see here, along with Samuel Ensign and Ferris Wells. Those were the 3 men who built this mill. For Isaac Chase was a New York miller who brought his heavy milling irons with him across the plains and established this mill. This is the oldest building in the city. It's older than the Lion House, the Beehive House. It was completed before the temple was even begun. This is a very significant building, architecturally, historically. This is the building that provided the flour that fed the people that lived here. Taggart's importance to the early days of Utah, very significant. He knew Brigham Young personally. I found just yesterday some financial records at Utah State University showing in Brigham Young's ledger book him paying Taggart directly for Taggart's work for Brigham Young. So Brigham Young employed him to do carpentry projects for him. This is one of them. This mill ended up being partially owned by Brigham Young. It was called Brigham Young's Lower Mill. And then Brigham Young took over the entire mill and owned the entire mill. So when George Washington Taggart came to Utah, he worked on several very important mill buildings. This was the first one. It was built between 1849 and 1852. So he worked on it in 52. That's when he came. The millwright, the architect who designed the building, was named Frederick Kessler. And he was the territorial millwright. So he designed these mills, and then Taggart and others built the mills. In fact, Kessler, who died in 1899, he came the year he died, and he wrote his name on this piece of wood up here in pencil. It says F. Kessler, 1899. It's still up there. The other mills that Taggart worked on included the Bountiful Mill, the North Canyon Mill. This one he did for Heber C. Kimball, Brigham Young's counselor. And that building no longer exists, but the foundation exists, and there's a little monument there. And that was built from 52 to about 54, so it was the second project. And so Taggart goes from this really important mill to another really important mill, both from general authorities. And then he goes up to Brigham City and works on the Smith Snow Mill. That Snow is Lorenzo Snow, who became president of the church. And it was built in 1855-56, and that building is still standing. Another adobe building, another one with the clerestory monitor. What that is that upper set of windows, that second roof, an upper set of windows that brings light into the upper portion of the mill and allows for these long metal horizontal drive trains to run through the mill with pulleys, and the pulleys operated belts, and the belts ran the machinery. This was an automated mill. One man and one boy run this entire three-story building by themselves all day long. It was based on Oliver Evans's automated mill design, an important American miller who came up with the idea. So Brigham Young, Taggart, Kessler would build these very top-of-the-line automated mills. So the fourth mill, and it's possible that Taggart also worked on Heber C. Kimball's mill here in Salt Lake, which was an oil mill, a flour mill, flax mill. It's kind of a multi-purpose mill. It was just a couple of blocks from where Taggart lived. The fourth mill is the Franklin D. Richards Mill in Farmington. That's the big stone mill. It's still there, built in 1861-62. And it became the Heidelberg Restaurant for any of you who lived around here a long time. And after it was a mill, it became a restaurant. So out of the four most important mills in the valley, or in this Wasatch area, Taggart worked on all four of them. Very highly regarded by Brigham Young. In fact, another sign of that is the fact that Taggart got a very favored building lot. His lot is where the McCune Mansion is now. That's where the two-story adobe Greek Revival Taggart house was, right north of Temple Square, on one of the really valued pieces of real estate. Usually, the general authorities got all those best lots. So he was so valued by Brigham Young that he got one of the pristine lots. So that last mill. All four of those mills were built for general authorities, and three of the four are still standing. The other one has the foundation. I think the fact that they're still around is significant. Most of those 1850s and 60s buildings are long gone. There are only a handful left in the whole state. And yet the ones he worked on were so well built, this level of craftsmanship that we see, so well built that they've survived to this day. I think that's important. I've got some notes. Let me just look. Okay, so 1850, Potawatomi County, the 1856 census, that's the first one in Utah. He's in the 18th ward. Well, that's Brigham Young's ward. And that's where his house was built. In 1860, well, 1850, he's called a joiner. In 1850, the 60, he's called a farmer. It's interesting that he identified himself as a farmer, not as a carpenter or a joiner or a millwright, which is really what he did primarily. In 1870 census, he calls himself a miller. Now he's in Morgan County, and in fact he is a miller. So after all of those big projects for church leaders, those major mills, he decides to build his own mill with the infant mills. And it's a smaller mill, it's a simpler mill, but he spends really the last decades of his life being a miller and producing flour himself in his own mill. In 1880, the last census that we have, he calls himself a farmer. And by that time, he's aged and really not able to do mill building anymore, but he can be a miller, he can be a farmer. There is no 1890 census, they were burned. And then he died in 1893. 1893 is the year the Salt Lake Temple was completed. And he worked on the temple. He worked on the Nato Temple, and he worked in the early days on the Salt Lake Temple. And I think it's interesting that he died the year the temple was completed. So I was going to tell you my Taggart lineage. So, okay, so Harriet Atkins Bruce, the one who had a single daughter, Eliza Ann Taggart. She married George Albert Goodrich, and there are some Goodriches here, so we're even closer cousins. And they had 11 children, one of which was Mary Augusta Goodrich. And she married William Highland Gagan, used to be called Gahagan, it's Irish, from a town west of Dublin. That was the father of my grandmother, Ella Rose Gagan, and she had my dad, Laurel Eugene Roberts, and then Ellen Dale Roberts. So George Washington Taggart was my great-great-great-grandfather. Well, those are factual things. You know, we know statistics. I mean, we know how tall Taggart was. We know his eyes were blue. We know he had dark hair. We know these details. We know from his own writing that he was a devout Latter-day Saint. But I think it's interesting to go deeper into his life and try to understand the trials that he endured and how those allowed his family to survive, and then through those families we all exist now today. So there is a thread of continuity, a thread of humanity that ties us to him in ways other than just the genealogical chart in the family tree. So there's a little film over there that was done with Steve Berlin some years ago that talks about the Chase Mill and George Washington Taggart. And so I invite you to look at that. And I'm happy to answer questions. I think rather than lecturing or giving you more statistics and things, why don't we just chat together for a bit.
How did they get those huge beams up there? They were men, they didn't have houses. How did they get them?
Well, this is yellow pine and white pine from the mountains nearby, and the most important first building in every community was a sawmill. And I think Taggart probably built some of those too, because the sawmill produced the lumber, the flooring, the floor joists, the rafters, the millwork to build any building, houses, meeting houses, schools, flour mills. So the first building in every community had to be a sawmill. And this, by the way, this was the first industrial park in Utah. This group of buildings, you've got the Isaac Chase House over here that's still standing. There was a lumber mill, there was a carding mill for wool. There were some other mills, and this building and the house remained, the other buildings are gone. So they brought the timbers in from the mountains, and then they cut them into their shapes. They had wagons. I mean, they brought granite blocks from Cottonwood Canyon to the temple. If they could bring hundreds of tons of granite blocks, they could bring wood. Now, in the basement, when we started working on this project, I worked on it for several years, did 2 big research reports, 2 archaeological digs, and then the restoration. It took a long time. The basement was underwater. If you went down this stairway, about 3 steps, it in the water. It was like 7 to 8 feet of water. So we had to de-water the building. So we dug a trench around it, and we put pipes in the bottom to collect water, perforated pipes. And we had 2 pumps that are continually pumping water out of here. I mean, we have the aviary pond right there. So if the pumps turned off, within a day, this thing would be a swimming pool down there, 7 feet deep. And the second pump's an emergency pump in case the first one goes off, and that actually happened one weekend. Anyway, so we had to excavate and dry out the basement. And there are these posts and beams down there that look like these, but they're new. And we had to, there is no first cut timber available in Utah, so we had to get them from the state of Washington. So those posts and beams downstairs that match these, and we exactly matched Tackert's design, exactly, the lambstuck and everything. They came from the state of Washington, were hauled out here, put in the basement to match these, because they were gone when we started. And you'll notice that there's a little amphitheater. When we started, that wasn't there. This was a 2-story building, but the Chase Mill was a 3-story building on that side. And we had pictures and documentation. So we dug out that hole and found that sandstone wall completely intact, really in good condition, and created that amphitheater out there to get the building to look like it did back in 1852. Other questions? Yes?
Well, I kind of assumed this building was moved here. Apparently it wasn't. I'm kind of curious how much of the original building is actually original, like you said,
the exterior is, the walls are very thick adobe walls. The first material that they built out of was adobe. Brigham Young did not like wood buildings. He didn't like log cabins, and he didn't like wood frame building. He loved adobe. In fact, he thought adobe over time turned into stone. He gave a lecture in 1851. If you want to look it up, it's in the Journal of Discourses, volume 1, page 217. And it says that the pyramids of Egypt were actually made out of adobe, and that they hardened into stone. So his chemistry was a little off. And he actually wanted the Salt Lake Temple to be made out of adobe. And fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and they made it out of granite, or we would have had the world's largest Gothic adobe mud pile. So the adobe on the building was in poor shape, but you can see the original adobe there at that west wall. That's what it looked like. It's made out of Bonneville clay. It's 4 inches tall, 5 inches wide, 12 inches long. And they just packed the clay into these wooden forms, and then they flipped them over and dried them out in the sun for a week. And by the way, they may have gotten the idea to make the adobe from the Mormon Battalion, somebody like George Washington Taggart, because in San Diego, the existing buildings that the Mormon Battalion came across were adobe buildings. And the adobe wore out over time, so another architect before our firm got involved put new simulated adobe on the outside. So the outside is not original. It's laid over the top of about 3 widths of original adobe, but the structural walls are original. These posts and beams, all these joists are original. The equipment is long gone except for this little cogwheel right here. There's an old painting done around the turn of the century showing the stone platform and some of the other material. But this building was abandoned as a mill in 1879. The reason being that everybody east of here took all the water for themselves and they couldn't get any water here. And so they built the Leffler Mill, which is over in the 9th and 9th area. The same miller that ran this at the end ran that, and then that one shut down. So this has not been functional. This building was abandoned in 1879. So that's 130 years ago, this building has been abandoned, essentially. And for a while it served as a blacksmith shop. For a while it was a place to warm up for the ice skaters on the pond over here. And then in 1899, the city decided to tear it down. So how is it that it's still here? The Daughters of Utah Pioneers, a newly organized group, I think in 1897, their first project was to save this building. So it's like the little ladies in tennis shoes that saved Mount Vernon. You know, that Mount Vernon was going to be torn down too. So we have those sisters to thank. And they were able to save this building. They had a little kind of a mimic of a mill in here, not very authentic or well researched. And finally, in about 1983, I convinced Louise Green, the head of the DUP, to let me do a research report on the mill that she funded. And it resulted in that little pink book that's the first DUP book written A by a man, B footnoted. And they sell it for, what, $2? So, anyway, next question.
I don't think these kids understand what a millstone is or how grain is put into the millstone and how flour is produced.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
You mean you just don't go to the store and just buy that stuff and it's just automatically there? Yeah, I mean, there was a process. So, like I said, it was an automated mill. So people would bring barrels of wheat to this building and it would be hoisted up to the top floor. The first thing, there was a smutter machine that would clean the wheat because lots of times it wasn't clean. And then there were two stones, the bottom stone, and these are literally stones, they're round, and they have grooves in them, and there's a bed stone that's stationary, and then there's what they call a runner stone, which is the upper one that moves. Now the turbines move at a certain revolutions per minute. An overshot wheel goes 6 revolutions per minute, like the one out at the Gardner Mill by Archibald's restaurant. 6 revolutions, very slow, it moves. And then that wheel is on an axle, and there's a smaller wheel, cogs, and that cog wheel interacts with other cog wheels, and each of them lead to a machine. So when you go from a bigger diameter wheel to a smaller one, it picks up revolutions. So by the time you get to the grinding stone, the upper runner stone is going around 106 revolutions a minute. Very fast, just like that. And there are controls where you can have the two stones close together or not so close. And so if they're close, it grinds the wheat to a certain fineness. If it needs to be finer, you tighten it up and you regrind it a couple of times until you get fine flour. So the primitive mills could only provide cracked wheat, and they couldn't get flour. But this was a commercial mill. This wasn't just a primitive mill. This was not a grist mill. This was a flour mill that produced fine flour for bread. And so you had other machines that cooled off the flour because it was hot and it would stick together. So there's another machine that was like a comb, like a hair comb, only it was horizontal, went around in a circle and would keep all the flour separated until it cooled off. And then there was another machine that packed it into barrels. And you know, like I say, this whole building was full of machines. You could barely walk through it. And mills usually didn't survive. They usually exploded, blew up, because the air was so full of this fine flour that any spark would cause an explosion. So the Empire Mill that Brigham Young had up City Creek Canyon had a 40-foot water wheel, huge mill. One day, some spark occurred, and it just exploded, and the whole mill blew up and burned to the ground, just like that. And that's why they use wooden shovels. If you go to a historic mill back east that's running, you'll see wooden shovels and other wooden things. They didn't want two pieces of metal to come into contact and create a spark. So that's why there are very few mills left, and it's a miracle that we still have 3 of the 4 mills that Taggart worked on. Most of the rest of them burned to the ground. Yes, in the back.
The millstones, have they been located for this mill?
Well, there's a monument with one of them out here. And some of them were made locally, but the best ones, when you hear the term burr stone, that they come from France and Belgium. There's actually an area called Burr, B-U-H-R, B-U-R-R, and they would come in pieces, pie-shaped pieces, and then all the pieces would be put together with a metal band around them. And so Brigham Young would send to France and Belgium for the highest quality burr stones. They were very hard, and they wouldn't ship easily. The stones out here are softer, and you have to keep retooling the grooves every so often. So there is a burr stone out here, though. Well, thank you. I think you said I could talk for half an hour. It's probably up, but I appreciate being here. I hope we appreciate our heritage. I hope we have the ability to connect ourselves with the past and see ourselves in these people and see them in us.